Well, welcome everybody. This is John Sarver, and I'm filling in for Mark Clevey as your host tonight. And this is a renewable energy seminar tonight. The topic's going to be the critical role of young people in the solar energy movement and the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. We're really happy to have Will Lawrence here as our presenter. He's the co-founder and former National Partnership Director for the Sunrise Movement. And we have to give thanks to our financial sponsors, the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, McNaughton and McKay, Iron Ridge Racking, and Harvest Solar. Oops. Well, GLREA, as probably everybody knows, was founded in '91 and as a statewide nonprofit. And a lot of you are members. Those who aren't would love to have you join, which you can do on our website, glrea.org. There's a series of Zoom presentations over the course of a month. The first Thursday is Ann Arbor Solar Stories. Julie Roth hosts. Usually Mark Clevey is hosting the second Thursday, this renewable energy seminars, which covers a variety of topics. And then Diane Van Buren, the third week, does Detroit Solar Stories. And I come in toward the end of the month doing Michigan Solar Stories, which covers the rest of the state. The thing I'd like to kind of emphasize, please mute yourself while the presentation's going on. And hold your questions till the end of the presentation. At that time, you can raise your hand. You can do that under reactions. You can kind of raise your virtual hand and I'll call on you in the order that you present yourself. I am thrilled to have Will here to speak. He's a climate and housing justice advocate based in Lansing. Back in his 20s, in his youth. He was the co-founder and National Partnerships Director of the Sunrise Movement, where he helped put forward the Green New Deal, which I bet everybody has heard of that, on the national political agenda and build the legislative momentum that did lead to the Inflation Reduction Act. Now in his 30s, he's organizing in Lansing for tenant rights and green social housing. And so, like we've indicated, Will tonight's going to talk about the critical role of young people and the implementation of the IRA. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Will.
Thank you, John, for that kind welcome. Really glad to be here. I met John, I think back in probably early 2018 or late 2017, even when we were just starting to build Sunrise. And as he said, as some of us were getting on, it was a ragtag outfit then, and to some extent at every step of the way. But we have had a lot of success in bringing climate justice and renewable energy development nearer to the center of our national political agenda. There's still a long way to go, of course. So I'm going to share my screen and go to this presentation. Can you see this? Okay, great. All right. Okay, this is me. Hi, I grew up in East Lansing. I graduated from ELHS in 2008. I ended up out at college in the Philadelphia region and got involved in social movement organizing in college. And shortly after, I was a researcher for a project called the Global Nonviolent Action Database, which got me thinking about it a lot about the dynamics of change, social movements, politics, how people power can actually be exercised in the face of so much corporate power and dominating power from above. Got really involved in a bunch of student movements, especially in the climate and environmental justice space. became a co-founder and coordinator of something called the Fossil Fuel Divestment Student Network, which was a bit of a mouthful, but a worthy cause and still is. And that was, about a decade ago when that divestment effort was just getting started and starting to pick up steam in a big way. So we were working alongside, the folks at 350.org and Bill McKibben, some of you may know, and some others. And then out of that, as our politics started to change in the middle part of the last decade, that student movement found a new expression in the political arena. And for us, that was as Sunrise Movement, which launched in 2017 and still exists. I was with Sunrise until February of 2021. So I'm not here as an official representative any longer of Sunrise, but I'm still a member of the movement. And I'm here doing some now housing and climate justice work here in Lansing, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end. Got a podcast coming up. That's my email. Let's get into it. From the Green New Deal to the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm going to fly through this. Please write down your questions, hold them. I'm assuming that we want to get here to 2023 and only spend as much time as we need to move through 2017. But I do think it's a good story to give some of the political context of how these political concepts evolved over these years. So Sunrise was established in 2017. As I mentioned, building on prior years of youth movement activity as a movement of young people to stop climate change and create millions of good jobs in the process. It was very important to us to smash the jobs versus environment narrative that was and still is in some cases a political hindrance to action on climate change. And we believe then and now that young people need more than just fear to successfully find a role in tackling the climate crisis. They need something to believe in. We need a future that we can feel good about. And the Sunrise was very clear about that from the beginning, that we wanted to name everything that's bad about the ecological crisis, of course, and our political order, while also giving people something to believe in. Our first public training was in June 2017. We had like 30 people there. It was very small. Summer of that year through spring of 2018 was a series of small actions of various kinds to publicize the movement. And then that summer, which was the first midterm election, you all remember, since Trump was in office. So there was a lot of energy around trying to respond and reclaim the House for the Democrats and so forth. We had 70 student fellows engaging hundreds of volunteers to, as we said, make climate change matter in the midterm election. So we recruited several hundred candidates around the country to sign the No Fossil Fuel Money Pledge to reject campaign contributions from those corporations. We endorsed left-wing primary candidates in the Democratic primaries. We actually endorsed Abdul El-Sayed here in Michigan for governor. We endorsed AOC in her primary race. In New York and other races like that around the country. But then we also, in the general elections in the states we were operating, we supported Democratic, you could say moderates, in those competitive general election races, including Whitmer after she had beaten out El-Sayed in the primary. So I point that out just to note that that's been our way of doing politics from the beginning. We consider ourselves to be on the left and in support of the kind of politics that AOC and Bernie Sanders really put forward. But we see ourselves as part of a necessary, often very frustrating alliance of interest with the liberals in the Democrat, the sort of so-called moderates in the Democratic Party, because that left liberal bloc is what you need in order to actually have majorities and get anything done right now in this country. And we sure know that the right is not going to take us where we need to go. So it's also the necessary political alliance to blocking the right. So, but it's also a relationship of antagonism between the left and the moderates. So on November of 2018, November 13th, this was 1 week after Election Day. So the Democrats have now reclaimed the House. People are feeling good. But Pelosi is out there saying some nonsense about what she's going to do or not do on climate. We showed up with 200 people to her office in DC, and where we were joined by the Congresswoman-elect AOC, and that was the same day that she introduced the first draft proposal for the Green New Deal. And the idea of the Green New Deal, as well as Sunrise as an organization, as well as AOC and her public standing, all kind of like we're on a big roller coaster headed upwards in terms of our just overall exposure and then followership during that period. And tons of organizations endorsed the Green New Deal in name within those first months. So again, I'm preaching to the choir here mostly, but the big idea from the beginning behind the Green New Deal was closely related to the idea that had animated Sunrise from the beginning, which is that we need this inspiring, comprehensive vision that people can see themselves in. And that took the form of this federal government-driven program of investment for decarbonization, green job creation, and racial justice. And so if you're putting yourself back in 2015, when most of the conversation about federal climate policy was still centering around trying to make some version of a carbon tax work, this was a different approach to politics that said, carbon tax is never going to work politically. It's never going to work. You need something that hits people where they live and they feel excited about. And the green job creation, the racial justice for a lot of people is super, super important. And then pairing that with the imperative to stop climate change. Now that's something that young people in particular, but then also people of all generations were much more willing to get behind in the streets. And the Green New Deal was never a singular policy proposal. It was never thought that it could be accomplished in a single act of legislation or a single executive action. It was, and still is, has always been just a big idea about the direction of the country in the 21st century. It's a governing agenda. And like any governing agenda, it requires dozens of acts of legislation at a federal, state, and municipal level over a decade to accomplish in its fullness. And the Green New Deal was designed to, and actually did, accomplish three things simultaneously in the years 2019 and 2020. It increased activism and public support for federal climate policy with young people as the tip of that spear by recentering public conversation about climate policy around this motivating vision of the Green New Deal, which made people want to get involved. Number two, we used the rising progressive flank as sort of exemplified by AOC and Bernie Sanders of the Democratic Party to legitimize and platform this big idea, and basically hitched our wagon to that faction, which, at that point, especially was in a, pretty pitched battle with the moderator establishment wing of the party on a lot of issues. But rather than making that a marginalizing move to hitch our wagon to the left flank, we actually did it in such a way that it created the conditions in Congress and ultimately in the Biden administration to pass the strongest possible climate policy via majority legislation in 2021 and 22. And that was the goal all along. But so we wanted to do something that could both be, you have the left flank version of the plan, which is the Green New Deal in full. Like, this is what we could actually do if politics was not an obstacle, but then do it in such a way that the whole party, even the people who don't want to endorse the Green New Deal in name, are now saying, yes, we're on board with climate policy. We may not like that Green New Deal, or I'm not ready to endorse that, but yes, I agree we need climate, jobs, and justice. We need to do it all together. Here's my policy telling you how we're going to do that. And so that is what developed over the years 2019 and 2020. So in 2019, the GND resolution gathered about 100, a little over 100 plus co-sponsors in Congress. That's under a dozen in the Senate, and then ultimately over 100 in the House. That's not a majority, but again, you had then the rest of the majority of the Democrats similarly getting interested in climate policy in a much more engaged kind of way without having to endorse the Green New Deal by name. As part of that, the Senate and House Democrats formed these special committees to produce more policy so that they would have things to go if they were to recapture, the full government on the other side of 2020. And as part of that, we also put a big effort into challenging the Democratic primary candidates in the presidential race to race to the top on climate policy. So all the candidates from Beto, Bernie, Warren, Biden, Cory Booker, Kamala, and all the rest, all were trying to outdo themselves on their climate policies. as the presidential campaign was unfolding in 2019. Sunrise endorsed Bernie. It didn't work out in the end for Bernie, but after Joe Biden won the primary, there was these sort of unity task forces, so-called, that were about basically cutting a deal between the left flank and the moderate flank of the Democratic Party, so that hopefully the Bernie voters would vote for Biden in the fall, and young people being, at the top of the list among the Bernie voters who might have been liable not to go for Biden. So as part of that, it was very much in their interest to invite Varshini, who is my friend and the executive director, fellow co-founder of Sunrise, to sit on that task force with some other Green New dealers. And Biden's climate plan, which had Sunrise had somewhat infamously given an F- in the primary when it was quite smaller and less developed, it actually increased dramatically by around an order of magnitude, and took the broad contours of what ultimately became known as his Build Back Better platform. And in that, he really did take on, again, I would never call it a Green New Deal, and we didn't, but it took on the sort of political logic of the Green New Deal, albeit on a smaller scope. 2021, Biden introduced that Build Back Better Act, you remember, he introduced it as the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan. It was introduced as Build Back Better Act in Congress. It passed the House, and then Manchin started to block it in the Senate. This here is a picture from some Sunrisers on hunger strike that September, trying to push the White House and Congress's hand when this bill was in limbo. This was actually just before Manchin killed it for the first time. In 2022, then Manchin came back to the table. He strung everyone along. He killed it again in, sometime in mid-June. Everybody thought it was dead. And then he came back to the table one more time. His staff, Schumer's staff, after what had been 3 years with, you can imagine a whole preponderance of coalition processes and different white papers and different versions of the bill text being written and rewritten over and over again in a million different configurations. The last crack at it was undertaken by a select number of Manchin staff, a select number of Schumer's staff, and Brian Deese from the Biden administration. And they wrote that bill and they presented it to everybody else as a fiat, a done deal. And people said, all right, that's the best we can do. And it passed and signed. It was renamed the Inflation Reduction Act because, Manchin thought that would be better politicking. And who knows, maybe it was. But what's in the Inflation Reduction Act? So I love, this was actually a really interesting slide that was produced by the New York Times. This is a visualization of Biden's initial proposed agenda. You see it's at $4.3 trillion. This was the one he gave to Congress in early 2021. This green stuff up here is all the clean energy stuff. Sunrise was fighting for the Civilian Climate Corps, which was basically like a big jobs program for young people to get jobs in renewable trades and other forms of environmental remediation. And this is what Sunrise, this was a big issue for Sunrise, even though you see it's a relatively small slice of this overall pie, because it was part of that mission I was telling you about from the very beginning, about young people being able to see something for themselves. Imagine the opportunity if someone is able to go join the Civilian Climate Corps for a couple of years, they're 19 and then they're working in some trade. We just thought that could have the potential to be politically and economically transformative. Didn't ultimately make it through, but now I'm getting ahead of myself. There's a lot of stuff in here. All this child tax credit, paid family and medical leave. I think it's worth sitting with how transformative this vision actually was. Now, again, I wouldn't call it a Green New Deal because Bernie's Green New Deal was 4 times the size of this agenda down here. But if this had passed in full, and the Biden administration really did want to pass it, had Manchin and Sinema not said otherwise, people would have been calling this Green New Deal-like. Again, we could quibble, but the scope of this is pretty extraordinary, especially given that what actually passed is this, and is still considered to be an extraordinary legislative achievement, and so on and so on. So what you see is everything related to family and medical leave, childcare, education, home-based care, free community college, pre-K, all this educational and care stuff on this side all got cut out, except for these one little slice of ACA subsidies to fill some gaps in ACA. Schools, this would have been schools' physical infrastructure to basically a Green New Deal for every school in like rehab and stuff, cut out entirely. Housing went from like 250 billion, which would have been for energy efficient housing and new affordable housing to deal with the housing crisis, cut from 250 to a measly $11 billion. This is the infrastructure stuff here in yellow that was passed with bipartisan support as part of the so-called infrastructure bill that passed even before the IRA. And then this R&D and manufacturing, if you've heard of the CHIPS Act, that's in there. That's around competitiveness and the sort of semiconductor supply chains with China. That was a separate bill. And then this green stuff up here was the Inflation Reduction Act, plus this ACA piece. But what's interesting looking at this, you'll note that when the whole thing went through the ringer, lots of stuff cut out. Again, it's a damn shame when I look at this thinking about what we could do with some of the stuff that had gotten cut and what we would be doing with it right now. But even so, it's noteworthy politically that the climate stuff, relatively speaking, just the hard nuts and bolts climate stuff that is narrowly targeted at decarbonization, made it through better than almost anything else on this entire chart. And so that reflects the fact that when we could legislate on one thing under this very narrow Democratic majority, it turned out to be climate. So that's pretty interesting. But why was it that this actually worked? What were the sort of political economy, if you will, of the IRA that made it so that Manchin did not in the end spike this version of it? Well, it's all carrots, it's no sticks. Anything that would have been, first of all, they couldn't regulate directly because it was a reconciliation bill, but that's another thing. Even within what they did, they cut out anything that was any kind of sanction or the big oil or big corporations in general would not like. And so in the end, the big oil loves the bill because it's functionally an all of the above energy bill that does give support to certain things. The natural gas industry gets a lot of support. The idea of carbon capture and storage, which big oil loves, gets a lot of support, and they're dreaming of building out a national pipeline network, just like they're currently building natural gas pipelines to be able to pipe liquefied carbon gas. And so they love it. And this is why in the end, this is a fun slide here that says, GOP lawmakers are lobbying the oil industry to denounce the tax and climate bill. The GOP wanted this not to succeed because they didn't want to give Biden the win. And they called big oil, and big oil said, oh, actually, we like this. This is fine. We'll let it pass. And that was the Manchin effect. What else is in it? A huge emphasis on domestic procurement and domestic manufacturing. This has caused a reaction in Europe. It's fair to say that this bill is anti-Europe, anti-Asia, and pro-America in its orientation, and pro-North America in its orientation to manufacturing and incentives. Furthermore, the way the incentives are designed was pretty explicitly intended to drive a large proportion of benefit to red states. So this is an attempt to scramble the domestic political economy of being for green energy by just really sending the dollars and the benefits and the jobs to red states. The hope is that this will break the impasse over the next decade and kind of reconfigure the whole terrain on that. There are some signs that might be starting to happen. And then again, I'm stealing some of these points from Ted Furtick and Tim Sahay, who have a really great presentation they gave at Brown on the IRA, a couple of other guys who worked even more extensively than me on the policy front, but they coined this as bottomless mimosas as a key design principle of the IRA, which actually really changes the game. Unlike most tax credits, these IRA incentives are bottomless and uncapped. That means that if you're generating renewable energy, you can, as long as you can keep generating renewable energy, you can keep going back to the Treasury for an infinite number of these tax credits. You're only limited by the amount of projects you can actually bring online. And this could be either generation or investment tax credit. And the one report by Credit Suisse estimated that because of this, the Congressional Budget Office may have actually lowballed how big this is going to be. They estimated that the total incentive package was $369 billion. They thought it could be closer to $1 trillion, depending on how many groups actually go out there and claim it. So some people, like, the upside on this is actually really extraordinary in terms of the impact it'll have on the renewables energy. Here's what's on the mimosa menu of those uncapped tax credits. Going from left to right, $2,000 per year consumer tax credit for like residential efficiency type improvements. $30 per megawatt hour for zero carbon electricity between 2024 and 2034. The longevity of these tax credits, as you know, is also a hugely significant factor. I mean, because many of these tax credits have just been getting renewed on a couple yearly basis, sometimes falling out. Now to have this security for the next 10 years is going to be really significant. $4,000 per consumer vehicle. There's a sustainable aviation fuel tax credit, and then this clean hydrogen tax credit, which some people think is actually the big kind of sleeping giant in this. But that depends on a lot of stuff around hydro that I am definitely not qualified to talk about. Here's something else that's in there. This looks pretty darn interesting for this crowd, so I put this in here in particular. This is going on the table this year. The Zero Emissions Technologies Program of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. $7 billion in competitive grants to states, municipalities, tribal governments, other eligible recipients. I think nonprofits are eligible. Grantees must direct all funding for prioritizing financial and technical assistance to projects that deploy residential and community solar and related upgrades. They're going to award 60 grants. That's $116 million average grant, based on my math, if you divide 7 billion by approximately 60 grants. So this is a $100 million plus grant sitting on the table to organizations that are able to provide some sort of upfront financing to better enable community solar to be deployed. Sounds pretty awesome. This is going to be, this application will be up this summer and will be awarded by next year. Unlike the tax credits, this is a one-time thing, but it's the one-time thing that could help set up some revolving loan fund or something of this nature. They could potentially work for the next decade. So I hope somebody on this call gets that money. Okay, so just wrapping up, I'm just going to give a couple of top line lessons, and then I want to get into the questions and answers and stuff. You know, I think just the experience of Sunrise shows that young people are energized to be part of the energy transition. They see it through the lens of climate, but they also see it through the lens of economic security. They just need to hear about it, see it, have an on-ramp to be a part of it. I think young people, I hear all the time, I could, you know, I don't know somebody who wouldn't want to train in a growing green trade if they knew that that was actually going to provide security for them. It's very appealing, but they need to know that there's going to be, you know, real jobs, real opportunities available on the other side of that. Number two, on the IRA, you know, I just observed that there are lucrative opportunities here. There are things that I just deeply regret having been cut out. Housing and building sector is at the very top of that list. And it's fair to say that the surviving incentives survived in part because many of them more favor big industry players, but there's lots of opportunities as well for small and medium-sized players, and it just is going to require some, you know, financial acumen in particular and coordination among bodies to figure out who can access the right incentives at the right times. I think it's safe to say that now that this model has passed DC and is a political winner, there was no electoral punishment in the last midterm against the Democrats for passing the IRA, which makes it unlike the Affordable Care Act. This is now like kind of a signed, sealed, and delivered political winner. And we can expect Democrats in Democratic-led states to want to replicate this model. So there are other blue states who have already gone above and beyond what the IRA is doing in a variety of policy areas. I think we should expect Michigan to do the same, but really we should all raise our expectations and insist that they do so, because they're all learning that this is really good politics. And I believe that under these conditions, if solar advocates increase our respective and collective coordination and ambition in response to these new conditions, there is now the political and financial terrain, it's ready for a huge increase in the actual amount of solar installation work that is happening over the next years. That means more jobs for contractors, workers, builders, installers. And I'm not exaggerating in the slightest when I say that we ought to be asking how we can increase the scale and pace of solar installation by 10 times within this decade, and then make sure everybody knows that that's happening, because that's going to be the thing that is going to feed on itself and will become the virtuous cycle where now you have the young people getting involved and you have people placing their chips on this industry as a good bet for the near future. Finally, I want to just leave you with this. This is something that Marshall and I have been cooking a little bit and bouncing around with some other people. As I mentioned, I've been doing a lot of housing advocacy here locally in the last 2 years because the housing crisis is just so severe and the rent is way too high and everybody is getting squeezed dramatically. Even here in the Tri-County region, capital region, we have a minimum 17,000 unit housing unit shortage over the next decade. It could be more than that. It's 17 to 30,000 units per the government's own data. And that is a shortfall of hundreds of thousands of housing units statewide. And so that's an urgent need. We know that green building is part of the whole decarbonization picture from the beginning. We also know that building new housing and of various kinds also presents new opportunities, both for energy efficiency and directly for solar energy generation. So when this is a beginning of my own response to my own challenge, which is we need to up our level of coordination and ambition. It might look something like this, where you could imagine municipal agencies here in Ingham County. It could be run out of the Ingham County Land Bank, for instance, or something of this nature, which is already developing housing, by the way, to serve as a lead housing developer for its region, aggregating the finance, the land, the designs. There's ways of doing municipal finance, get MISTA involved. Obviously, you're contracting on the building side, and then the legislator should be putting more money in to make all of this more possible, although it's not strictly necessary. If you get that going, then there's a whole energy wing of the same project that we could imagine, where GLREA or its allies could coordinate overall energy install. So we could say, we're building 1,000 housing units in Ingham County in the next 2 years, and each of them is going to be, the ones that are cited for solar are going to get solar, and we're just going to do top of the line what we can do. But we're going to work with Michigan Safe to provide the financing. We're going to get the contractors on board, and then we're going to loop in whatever IRA subsidies we can find through these various avenues, which will also make the housing, more developable, because now potentially some of the energy stuff can be turned into a revenue stream and a net gain for the project rather than a net loss. Now, I'm not a policy wonk. I just am an organizer and a movement builder who pays just enough attention to policy to be able to ask stupid questions like, why is it that we can't actually achieve this? And then, and then we talk about it, and then we'll figure out something that'll be maybe a little bit different than this, but something of this type. So that's just a little provocation, some ideas to maybe lead us into some of the conversation about what's possible. But I just say again, as the bottom line, I think the table is served, as it were, for a lot more coordination, a lot more ambition. That should include more policy passed at the state level, like the community solar stuff that's going into the legislature now. So again, the political conditions are ripe. And because the political conditions are ripe, the financial conditions are also ripening. So we need to put ourselves in a position to be able to harvest both. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Will. Yeah, now, if you'd like to ask a question, just, raise your hand. You can do that under reactions, and you can see raise hand there. So, yeah, questions or comments? Go ahead, Dave.
Thank you. Very nice, William. I appreciate your speaking. And I wondered if you could comment on well, the main complaint I hear about solar electric cars at all is, oh, the grid won't handle it. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I don't think that there's any, I just don't think there's any reason to believe that that's true. The first principle of decarbonization, as I understand it, is that we need to electrify everything. So we actually are going to need to expand the capacity of the grid significantly, even if we are decreasing our overall energy use. Now, that's a sketchy proposition in itself, but we know that we need to basically the way to eliminate tailpipe emissions is to eliminate tailpipes. So you have to get people in electric vehicles or in public transit and then run that stuff off the grid. So the grid is in a bad shape in some places and it's going to need to be expanded, but that's just part of the process. And the only way out is through, is kind of what I would say. I mean, it's going to have to continue to grow and evolve, and there's going to have to be some tough choices made along the way. The permitting situation, is less than ideal. So that's another place where we need to be going back and building more policy at, including at the state level, to be able to allow projects to move faster while actually increasing rather than decreasing the quality of the public engagement that's happening. That often gets pitted as an either or, but I don't really think that it is that way. So anyway.
Go ahead, Vince.
Oh, thanks so much. And thanks for the discussion. It's great to hear. I have to wonder, with all the trouble the utilities are having with blackouts, and especially Ann Arbor, I'm Ann Arbor, so I see it happening here. And Ann Arbor is trying to pull away from DTE as best as they can. And I would like to as well as a homeowner here. We have a passive solar house, south-facing roof, but solar, generate electricity that they're not going to give us much for it besides what we use. Anyway, I wonder if it gives us an opening with all these troubles they're having right now. I mean, that's a potential. I mean, it's kind of like out of the blue, but that's something we might want to consider trying to maximize.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm here in Lansing where we have Board of Water and Light, and Board of Water and Light is just a headache anytime you try to deal with them. But the only thing worse than having a public utility is having a private utility. And so I'm all in favor of more public utilities because it at least offers the opportunity for more accountability. And what happened here in Lansing is that BWL got creamed after the ice storm in 2013. Everybody was so mad. And then they went and they made a bunch of tough decisions, cut down some trees, and they did so much better in this storm. So that actually kind of shows in its weird way the accountability in action. Meanwhile, DTE only answers to the shareholders. So they didn't learn a thing and they never will.
Go ahead, Amy.
Thank you. I just had a question because you sort of presented a bleak picture for carbon taxes when you were giving your history of the Green New Deal. But 49 senators were on board for a carbon tax and dividend policy as part of the BBB. Unfortunately, Manchin was the one who killed it in that. Do you feel differently about a possible carbon tax with the dividend component now? And do you think that's an appropriate stick to go with all the carrots?
What is the policy that was in the BBB that you're referring to as having been a tax and dividend?
So it wasn't, I don't think there was anything written, and I know Marie is here. She's also from Citizens Climate Lobby, but there were at least 49 senators verbally on board with adding a carbon fee and dividend. I think this was probably at an earlier stage than before it was written, maybe, but it was like pretty close to being part of the policy.
Yeah. I'm going to be a little blunt. From my perspective, it was dead from the beginning. And it was never in the conversations I had, no one ever had an expectation that that was going to get written into the BBB Act in Congress. and it never had a chance because no one ever even thought that it was going to get 50. Now, if we had 52 senators and somebody was going to, wanted to put some juice into trying to push a certain kind of tax with a certain kind of rebate, I think the concern is always, is this, is this a regressive tax and so forth and so forth, but with the right dividend, you can avoid that. So I'm not philosophically opposed to a carbon tax, but I do think the political record has shown that it's difficult. There might be other things that I would want to go back and shore up and win. There would not be that. I would want to do green housing and green buildings, and just keep going sector by sector through certain sectors that are not already covered before I would go for an economy-wide carbon price. That's just because of the politics of it.
Well, you kind of laid out some thoughts about what we should be doing here in Michigan. And I think we do have some assets or, pluses, like Michigan Saves, I think is a tremendous success story of financing solar efficiency improvements. And I'm just wondering, well, one gap I see is, do we have enough people, electricians, solar installers? That's a big, I think it'd be a big issue problem for doing that 10 times installation work. But when you look at the big picture, what do you see as kind of what we're missing, especially here in Michigan? Where are the gaps that are going to be our problem areas to kind of move this whole thing forward?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first gap is a coordination gap, probably, to be able to, like, again, I think the sort of nature of the solar industry is a little different from the bigger utilities who are doing industrial scale solar or industrial scale wind, just in the sense that, there's just a much wider variety of businesses and contractors and so forth. So, like, and again, it just, without being an expert in the slightest in the specifics of the policies that are needed to, fill all the little gaps, it's like, it's first a coordination problem, because a bunch of people, there's resources on the table, a bunch of people stand to benefit together if those resources can be accessed, but it's highly likely that they won't be accessed fully without coordination. Because it's like, again, Michigan Saves needs to be at the table to be able to fill the financing gap, which still exists. And the trades need to be at the table, or the community colleges need to be at the table in order to be able to think about the labor supply issue. And then the contractors need to, there's also just like a limited supply right now. Trying to build anything is really hard, just because there's a limited number of workers, there's a limited number of contractors. If we're talking about, something which is a semi-public, or public or semi-public led effort as well, there can be difficulties with getting people to want to take government contracts because there's so much red tape, and then blah, blah, blah. They have an impression that it's not reliable. We need to change all of those narratives by basically being able to achieve economies of scale on all of those things, but they only can happen together, as part of an integrated sort of circuit of the money and the workers and the projects. So we need to get to a situation where whether it's a nonprofit or a public or a semi-public agency that's coordinating parts of this process in municipalities, the contractors actually want to be in good because they know that that's going to be, there's going to be new projects every year as long as these IRA benefits are flowing through 2034, So it's like, I think overall what we really need is coordination, and we need public capacity to be able to build out all this stuff at the scale that we need to do. We're at the end of a 50-year process of neoliberalism, which has, been about the erosion of public capacity and the ability to actually plan proactively through the public sector. That all needs to be rebuilt. So I think that's like that's a coming together of various people to find some sort of network of, a nexus of problem solvers. There needs to be a problem solvers table where people can come sit down, and it's the right parties. And then people can figure out, okay, how to actually go after the 10X vision together.
Yeah, that is an ambitious goal. I've heard a little about the land bank project in Lansing, which is going to be solar, among other things. Are you familiar with that project? Are you familiar with what I'm referring to?
Yeah, so Ingham County I've been showing up to their Housing Trust Fund Committee meetings for the last 18 months or so. And Roxanne Case for the Land Bank sits on that. But the Land Bank has been building some row homes and single family homes on some of the, distressed properties, vacant lots that have come into their possession over the last decade. I think the total scale is, still dozens rather than hundreds of total units. But that does make in Ingham County, the land bank, the public entity with the strongest claim to being a housing developer. So it's a place, to my mind, to build, but we're just starting to think about that. And I'm definitely on the outside looking in. But it's an interesting example because, again, public capacity is so, again, I don't want to give an impression I'm saying that when I talk about public capacity, I'm saying that like every piece of the work needs to be done in-house by a government agency. But I am saying we need the capacity, and I think it should be in the public sector because that's where the democratic accountability is, to be able to coordinate and orchestrate the activity of a wide variety of, nonprofit and financial and for-profit actors. So, yeah, and I think I answered the question about the land bank.
Yeah. It's to me, it sounds like a, where the whole issue of making solar accessible to lower income, middle income people is a big issue for GLRA and a lot of other folks. And Habitat for Humanity has done some good work. And when I heard about the land bank getting involved with that, I was thinking, well, that's very promising, because there's land banks all over the place trying to figure out what to do with the land they got. So that was interesting.
I
Yeah,
think that's one piece where it's like you got to be able to aggregate three things, and it's really the aggregation of the land and the finance, and then the human capacity, which is designing and building the actual thing. And the land banks have a big head start because they have a statutory ability to bank and aggregate the land, which isn't to be taken for granted.
right. Other sorts of questions, comments people have. John, go ahead.
Yeah, William, well, if we wanted to try and build closer relationships with Sunrise, does Sunrise have a presence in Michigan? And are they interested in state policy as well as federal policy?
Yeah, so Michigan, so Sunrise, there's a Sunrise MSU here in the Lansing area. They're actually working on divestment right now from MSU. And then there's some more like high school based chapters that are in Southeast Michigan. At this point, Sunrise is kind of getting out of the grass tops political game at the state and federal level for a while and reinvesting in kind of the next generation of youth organizing among high schoolers and others. But there's certain Green New Deal for communities is like the campaign frame that Sunrise is taking on. And it's about, again, in some cases tapping these IRA incentives, but in other cases just fighting for, green transit, green agriculture, and clean energy and environmental justice in the different places where the chapters are. But they're kind of doing it at their own initiative or pertaining to the local conditions rather than a way that's directed from the national staff. So it's in a more decentralizing moment, whereas in the sort of heat of 2019, 2020, it was a centralizing moment in order to build the power to try to do what could be done in Congress. So I think the short answer is probably not going to be the most powerful partner for GLREA on a systematic level this year, just for those reasons. But you can rest easy that there are young people being trained to keep stirring the pot.
Are there any other organizations in Michigan that seem to really speak to young people that are getting involved? Like, I mean, Citizens Climate Lobby, is that one, or is that more?
Not young people.
Yeah.
I mean, young people in general are in an anti-organizational moment, I would say, among Gen Z and millennials. I mean, the uprising in 2020 was super transformative experience of sort of street protest for a lot of people, and with Bernie off the agenda, some people are And in the conditions of the pandemic, the appeal of the electoral politics and the legislative politics has lessened. And more people have trended in a direction that I would say is more oriented on concerns of survival and mutual aid. And when the most vibrant protest movements right now are a little bit more anti-systemic, you might say, like there's the anti-cop city thing happening in Atlanta. That's an example of a land defense campaign that's really popular right now. People are streaming down there from all over the country. It's really amazing. But again, it's a little bit different in nature than a legislative campaign that's trying to pass a proactive agenda. So things have taken a bit of a more anti-authoritarian turn in the pandemic years.
Amy makes a comment in the chat room that what she's seen in Detroit, there's a lot of environmental justice groups that are attracting young activists. And so she mentions We the People, Detroit, and that's an interesting observation because I know, right, that the environmental justice issue is inspiring a lot of people. And obviously it's very closely related to the type of stuff we've been talking about and the type of stuff that GLREA is interested in. So that's a potential partner.
Honestly, I think the way to get people engaged is like, okay, so there will be advocacy stuff. I think that I really think the community colleges and getting the labor for our purposes here. I mean, we can talk about advocacy, but I think it's going to be a little tough in this decade, frankly, if you're not going to see another. I don't know. I hope we will. I don't think you're going to see another Sunrise that's quite so like legislatively lobbying oriented in this decade. I think the next most popular nationally oriented climate protest movement will look much more radical and will describe itself as anti-capitalist in nature. That's just kind of my sense of where things are going. So I think if you're thinking about young people engagement from the perspective of GLREA, I wouldn't think advocacy first. I would think, what can we do to get this trades pipeline really, really, really locked down and make sure that young people around the state actually know about those opportunities?
Well, I just want to make a follow-up comment, and I respect your analysis and I'll defer to your opinion because you're obviously much closer to youth organizing than I am. But the thing is that even though you all got an amazing piece of legislation enacted at the federal level, to say that the right or the fossil fuel interests aren't going to respond and walk away is simply not the case. And we can't ease up on the pedal on the accelerator. We got to take advantage of this moment and we got to really maximize what we can get out of it. And so I think advocacy is more important than ever. And because if we lose control of just take it at the federal level, if Biden loses president, we lose control of the Senate and the Republicans take over, they could easily roll back stuff. So
I sure agree. And I'm not saying anti-advocacy. What I'm saying is, you're also hearing me now being 32. And what I'm saying is, I don't organize 19-year-olds anymore. Right. I don't organize 18-year-olds. So your guess is as good as mine in some ways. And my advocacy, I'm organizing in a multi-generational sort of way with young people, but not just focused among high school and college students. So, and what I said about, so what I say about the direction of the youth movement is purely conjectural, like a old man commenting on young people's affairs. But
well, I'm not going to tell you how old I am. So if you're 32, you can imagine what the rest of us. But,
Yeah.
Hey, John, it might, since we're talking about advocacy, it sounds like the first opportunity for GLREA's active advocacy, and people are already talking about it, is the community solar bills. So don't you think that'll be the kind of first coming up?
Absolutely. And the great thing about community solar is that this really addresses the equity issue with solar and the fact that it will bring down barriers for low and moderate income families, communities of color, people that live in apartments or whose house isn't suitable for solar. So it addresses that issue. Whereas in the past, DTE and consumers have tried to argue that solar is for rich people in the suburbs. And if we can really galvanize a multi-coalitional effort to get behind community solar, that can really bring in a lot more people to the movement and everything. So I agree. It's a great opportunity.
Stay tuned, because you'll be hearing from us, GLREA, about an opportunity for you to help kind of push those bills along. So that's coming, I think, fairly soon. So
And John, I want to
to
give a shout out to Liv over at Groundworks as well. She's on here and she's doing some amazing work up in Traverse City and Petoskey. And so I think she's a perfect example of a younger organizer is doing great work.
Thank you, Liv. And anybody else? We only have just a few more minutes. Does anybody else want to make any final questions, final comments before we?
I'd like to ask about the grid. What do we know about the cost of the grid? How long is it going to take to get it up? And what about all the automobiles that are going to be coming in and using the grid? Where are we on this?
I think I'm going to pass on further comment on that because I just can't claim any expertise. My understanding is that it's an issue. It's a big issue. It's not in great shape, but it's a surmountable problem, like certain others, if people stay focused on it. But
yeah, the only thing I would add is that the Michigan Public Service Commission, they're very focused on improving the grid as well, because ultimately, they're the people that regulate the utilities. And so when the grid goes down, like it has the last couple of ice storms, that not only does DTE get a lot of political flack, the Public Service Commission does too, because their job is to represent the public and to make sure that utilities do the right thing. The other unique thing about Michigan is that since we're a peninsula, our grid is a little bit more unique than other states where you're surrounded by states. And we're also kind of overseen by MISO, which is one in the Midwest grid. And so they're going to be getting involved with the Michigan Public Service Commission to help build out the grid. The challenge, of course, is that Jim, is that it costs money. And so we have this tension between DTE going to the Public Service Commission in their most recent rate case. They're asking for $600 million and they're going to argue that this is necessary for building out the grid. But if the Public Service Commission grants that amount of money, then the rates go up for residential users. I mean, their proposal will raise rates 14 to 19%, which makes it much more stressful on working families who are trying to make ends meet, and they're having challenges with their own cash flow. So there's this tension out there. And so we just have to kind of work our way through it, like Will said.
Just with regard, because you mentioned the EVs, Jim, I do, I'm not supposed to say this too loud because we're here in the motor state, but the EV development trajectory that this IRA has taken us on is hugely concerning because we've now established a precedent where basically a EV SUV for everybody on planet Earth is going to be the presumed development trajectory that we've placed ourselves on. We're building batteries that are 6 times larger and heavier than they need to be because we're building EV SUVs rather than reasonably sized cars. Furthermore, we're building cars rather than building public transit, but that's another story. There's a story from the a report that was published by the Climate and Community Project, which, by the way, I think is the best think tank that I would say is, if you're on the left, squarely on the left, but like you're trying to flesh out the vision of the Green New Deal in a really comprehensive policy sense, kind of from the left flank of the discussion. But they produced a report which shows that the current development trajectory we're on with the EVs and without public transit is going to use 10 times more total lithium than if we go with a public transit heavy and smaller vehicle footprint. kind of development trajectory. So, you can't say that and win votes in the state of Michigan, I guess, but it is a big concern because those resource flows then have all kinds of geopolitical implications and so forth if you're thinking about the lithium mining and so on and so on.
Well, it's 8 o'clock, and thank you, Will, for a very interesting, stimulating discussion, and thanks for all participants for joining us tonight and for participating in the discussions. So I hope you join us next Thursday for a Detroit solar story. So again, thanks for participating. We'll see everybody. Stay safe. I guess we got some snow coming in Michigan. Take care.
Thank you.